My wife introduced 20 brand new marriage rules, so I responded with just one rule that completely shattered her system of control. Her entire power game collapsed in an instant. Update 1. The list was sitting on the kitchen counter when I walked in from work, carefully typed, laminated, and placed neatly beside my dinner plate. Across the top, in large bold letters, were the words, 20 new marriage rules. At first, I honestly thought it had to be some kind of prank. But the stern expression on her face as she stood near the refrigerator with her arms folded told me immediately that she was dead serious. "What's this?" I asked while picking up the laminated sheet. "I think our marriage needs more structure," she answered coldly, leaving absolutely no space for debate. "These rules will help both of us understand our roles better." I started reading through the list, and with every line my frustration grew stronger. Rule number 1. I had to keep my location shared at all times. Rule number 4. Any purchase above $50 required her permission first. Rule number 12. Whenever I went out with friends, I needed to send her hourly text updates. And the list continued, each demand becoming more controlling and unreasonable than the one before it. We had been married for 7 years, but during the previous 6 months our relationship had slowly started changing. At first, it was subtle little comments about my friends, suggestions about the clothes I wore, questions about exactly where I had been during the day. But this situation was on an entirely different level. "You can't honestly be serious," I said as I placed the sheet back on the counter. "I'm very serious," she replied immediately. "One of my friends has the same type of arrangement with her husband, and they've never been happier." I stared at her carefully and realized that the woman standing in front of me barely resembled the person I married. The woman I once knew had been supportive, thoughtful, and respectful of my independence just as much as I respected hers. Now she wanted access to my bank account, permission over my social life, control over my calls, and authority over every aspect of my routine. "I need some time to think about this," I said, forcing myself to remain calm even though anger was building inside me. "There's nothing to think about," she replied sharply. "These rules start today." At that exact moment, her phone lit up with a notification. She quickly flipped it over, but not before I noticed the group chat she shared with her friends. I had seen enough to understand what was happening. Suddenly, everything made sense. This wasn't truly about improving our marriage. It was about control. It was about impressing her social circle and proving she had complete power over her husband. All those lunches with the wealthy women from the country club, all those perfect social media marriages they constantly flaunted online, they had clearly influenced her. Or maybe they had simply revealed who she had really become. I chose not to argue anymore. Instead, I quietly finished my dinner while she watched me carefully, expecting me to explode with anger, beg for compromise, or start negotiating. But I refused to give her that satisfaction. My mind was already focused on something entirely different. Not on how to obey her 20 rules, but on how to end this ridiculous game permanently. When I finished eating, I smiled at her calmly. The expression on her face immediately changed. She looked confused because she had expected resistance, frustration, maybe even desperation, but certainly not confidence. What she failed to understand was that she didn't know me nearly as well as she believed. I had no intention of fighting her with 20 counter rules. I didn't need 20 rules. I only needed one. The following morning, I examined the list more carefully. Every single rule was even more absurd than I originally realized. Rule 6 required me to hand over every password to all my accounts. Rule 9 stated that I needed her approval before making plans with anyone. Rule 15 demanded photo proof whenever I was running late from work. Rule 17 limited my gym visits to 1 hour only 3 times a week, specifically during periods when she could verify my location. These weren't relationship boundaries. This was a prison disguised as a marriage. I watched her getting ready for her weekly brunch with her friends, carefully applying makeup while her phone vibrated nonstop with notifications. I casually picked up her phone to hand it to her, making sure I briefly glanced at the screen first. The group chat was active. Can't wait to hear how he reacted to the rules. My husband would never agree to something like that. You're so lucky. That was the moment everything became completely clear. I had turned into a trophy for her friend group. The obedient husband she could proudly display as proof of her control. The thought disgusted me. "Your phone," I said calmly while handing it back to her. "Thanks," she replied before narrowing her eyes slightly. "Have you thought more about our new arrangement?" "I'm still thinking about it," I answered evenly. 20 rules is a lot to absorb all at once. She looked satisfied by what she interpreted as submission. "You'll understand eventually," she said confidently. "This will make our marriage stronger." The moment she left the house, I sat down and carefully analyzed the entire situation. This wasn't simply about control inside our relationship. It was about appearances. She wanted her friends to see that she had fully domesticated her husband and turned him into someone who followed commands without question. What I couldn't stop wondering was how our equal partnership had transformed into a competition for dominance. Then I remembered how everything started changing about 6 months earlier, shortly after she began spending more time with the wives of her boss and his business associates. Those women constantly bragged about controlling every detail of their husbands' lives. They measured success by how completely they could dominate their marriages. My wife had once been independent, confident, and respectful of personal freedom. But little by little, she had started adopting their mindset until eventually she no longer viewed marriage as a partnership. She viewed it as power, boundaries. Now she was slowly transforming into someone I barely recognized anymore. I decided, for the moment, to play along with her game. That evening, I acted thoughtful rather than confrontational. I allowed her to believe I was seriously considering her demands. Meanwhile, I paid close attention to everything she did. Throughout dinner, she constantly updated her friends through text messages. "He's starting to accept it. I'm getting almost no resistance. This is easier than I expected." I caught glimpses of the messages as she typed. The disrespect behind her words irritated me deeply, but I kept my composure. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about saving our relationship from whatever toxic mindset had started poisoning it. During the following 2 days, she began actively enforcing several of the smaller rules. She reminded me repeatedly to keep my location sharing active. She questioned a $60 purchase I made after work. She called me twice while I was having lunch with a coworker. Every time, I responded with only mild resistance, enough to appear believable, but not enough to create a serious argument. At the same time, I was carefully preparing my response. I understood that if I argued over every individual rule, I would end up trapped in endless debates where she controlled the entire conversation. I needed something cleaner, something simple, something powerful enough to destroy the entire illusion in one move. On the third evening, as we sat down for dinner, she placed a small rule violation notepad beside my plate, yet another addition designed to track my supposed infractions. "Do you finally have something to say?" she asked, clearly expecting me to lose my patience and beg for compromise. "Actually," I replied calmly while meeting her eyes, "I've spent a lot of time thinking about your rules, and I've decided to add one rule of my own." Her eyebrows immediately lifted in surprise before narrowing suspiciously. "Your rule?" she repeated, sounding almost offended by the idea itself. "That wasn't part of the arrangement. Every relationship requires balance." I answered evenly while setting my fork down. "You've had time to decide what you want from this marriage. I've had time to think about what I want too." I could practically see her mind racing as she calculated whether opposing me directly would create more conflict than she wanted. Her entire strategy depended on maintaining the appearance that I was willingly accepting her authority. "Fine," she finally said while folding her arms tightly. I took a slow sip of water and held eye contact just long enough for my next words to carry their full weight. "My rule is simple," I said. "Every single rule you create for me applies equally to you. No exceptions." The color immediately faded from her face. "That's not how this works," she replied quickly. "It's exactly how this works now," I answered calmly but firmly. "Location sharing goes both ways. Financial approval for purchases applies equally. Hourly check-ins when going out, same expectation for you. But my friends, this isn't about your friends," I interrupted. "This is about our marriage. Either we are equal partners or we are nothing at all." She shifted nervously in her chair. Some of these rules don't make sense for me, she argued weakly. I'm not the one who. Who what? I challenged immediately. Who needs supervision? Who can't be trusted? Is that honestly what you think about me after 7 years together? She said nothing. She simply stared down at her plate in silence. Here's how this works, I continued. Starting tomorrow, both of us follow all 20 of your rules along with my one rule of equality. If either person breaks a rule, that specific rule is permanently removed for both of us. I paused briefly before continuing. And if you refuse to follow your own rules entirely, then the whole system disappears immediately. I watched realization slowly spread across her face. Her perfect little control system had suddenly turned against her. Now she would have to live under the exact same restrictions she created for me. This is ridiculous, she muttered at last. The whole purpose was to create structure in our relationship. No, I corrected her calmly. The purpose was control, and I refused to be controlled. I picked up my phone and opened the location sharing application she had insisted I install. Let's begin with rule number 1, I said. I've already activated permanent location sharing. I slid the phone across the table toward her. Your turn. She stared at the device as though it were dangerous. I need time to think about this, she said carefully. There's nothing to think about, I replied, repeating the exact words she had used against me days earlier. These rules take effect immediately. Her fingers tapped nervously against the table while the consequences of her own system slowly closed around her. She only had 3 possible choices. Follow her own restrictive rules, admit the rules were unreasonable, or refuse completely and expose her true intentions. What happens if I don't accept your rule? She finally asked, searching desperately for some kind of loophole. I shrugged slightly. Then we need to have a much bigger conversation about why you believe you deserve to impose rules you refuse to live by yourself. A heavy silence settled between us. Eventually, with obvious reluctance, she picked up her phone and enabled her own permanent location sharing. Good, I said quietly. Now let's discuss rule number 2. Phone passwords. I'll need yours the same way you demanded mine. As I watched the internal conflict spreading across her face, I realized the entire dynamic had already started shifting. This was never about domination or revenge. It was about restoring the balance that disappeared the moment she decided control mattered more than partnership. The second she was forced to live under her own rules, their true purpose became impossible to hide. And that was exactly what I wanted her to understand. The following morning brought the confrontation I knew was coming. She had spent the night regrouping, consulting her friends, and preparing a counterargument. We need to discuss these rules, she announced while I was making coffee. I agree, I replied calmly. Which rule is bothering you first? The hourly check-ins? The spending restrictions? The social approval requirements? Her jaw tightened immediately. This isn't what I intended, she snapped. You're twisting everything. Am I? I asked while leaning casually against the counter. Let's be honest. These rules were never about improving our marriage. They were created so you could brag to your friends about how completely you controlled your husband. Her face immediately flushed with anger and embarrassment. I had clearly hit the truth. That's not true, she protested, though her voice lacked confidence. I only wanted more structure. Structure would have started with a conversation between equal partners, I replied calmly. I interrupted because what you created wasn't structure, I said firmly. It was a power move, and now you're frustrated because I refuse to simply surrender. She immediately changed tactics. You're acting childish, she snapped. This back-and-forth approach solves nothing. Then let's solve it constructively, I replied calmly. Tell me which of your rules you personally believe are unreasonable to follow, and we'll remove those rules entirely for both of us. She froze for a moment, trapped by her own contradiction. If she admitted even one rule was unreasonable, her entire argument would collapse. But it was equally obvious that she had no intention of living under the same restrictions she created for me. This isn't supposed to be a negotiation, she finally said, trying once again to regain control of the conversation. You're right, I answered evenly. It isn't. Either the rules apply equally to both of us, or the rules disappear completely. That's my boundary, and I'm not compromising on it. At that moment, her phone buzzed with a notification. I raised an eyebrow slightly. According to Rule 16, I reminded her, all messages are supposed to be read aloud to your spouse. Who sent that? She instinctively tightened her grip on the phone. This is getting ridiculous, she muttered. It's your rule, I reminded her calmly. Was it the group chat? Are your friends waiting for updates about how successfully you've managed to control your husband? The expression on her face gave me the answer before she even spoke. They were absolutely waiting for updates. What exactly do you tell them about me? I asked, my tone becoming colder. Do you all sit there laughing about how obedient I've become? Is this some kind of competition to see who controls her husband the most? It's not like that, she protested weakly. Show me the chat, I said firmly. That's not a request. It's a demand. For a second, I thought she might refuse outright. But eventually, with obvious reluctance, she handed me the phone. I scrolled through the messages slowly, and every suspicion I had was confirmed. There were 6 women in the chat, including my wife, all comparing stories about their husbands. They ranked them by obedience, shared manipulation tactics, and congratulated each other whenever one of them gained more control at home. I handed the phone back to her. Congratulations, I said quietly. Looks like you're winning the contest for most controlled husband. I paused briefly. Unfortunately for you, I'm withdrawing from the competition. What exactly does that mean? She asked, her voice noticeably smaller now. It means I refuse to participate in this game anymore, I answered. I'm not going to become the subject of your social experiment or the joke in your group chat. I married a partner, not a prison guard. I walked over to the refrigerator, removed the laminated rule sheet still hanging there, and placed it on the counter between us. So here's what happens next, I continued. Either we both follow every rule equally, starting with you sharing your group chat messages in real time, or we tear this entire system apart and finally have an honest conversation about our marriage. Her eyes shifted nervously between the paper in my hands and my face, searching desperately for hesitation, weakness, or some opening she could use to regain control. She found nothing. You wouldn't understand, she tried to argue. The other wives. I don't care about the other wives, I interrupted immediately. I care about us. And right now, there is no us. There's only you giving orders and the husband you believe you can control. I pushed the rule sheet slightly toward her. Your move. Over the following days, her strategy constantly shifted as she cycled through every manipulation tactic she could think of. First came anger. She accused me of being unreasonable, paranoid, overly dramatic, and distrustful. When that failed to change my position, she switched to tears, crying about how she only wanted to feel safe and secure in our marriage. But I remained steady. Security doesn't come from control, I told her while she wiped tears from her face. It comes from mutual respect. When emotional pressure stopped working, she attempted to involve other people. Her mother suddenly called, pretending to be concerned about problems in our marriage. One of our mutual friends reached out to suggest I was being too harsh. I immediately recognized those conversations for exactly what they were, extensions of her attempt to pressure me into backing down. Every single time someone tried to mediate, I gave them the same response. This issue is between my wife and me. But did she tell you about the 20 rules she created, or only about my one rule? The silence that followed was always revealing. By the 5th day, she tried an entirely different strategy. Selective compliance. She agreed to follow certain rules while insisting others should only apply to me. I don't need spending restrictions, she argued. I manage money better than you do. That's not what our credit card statements suggest, I replied calmly. But if the rule feels unfair, we can remove it completely for both of us. That solution clearly frustrated her too. Every rule she gave up weakened the control system she had worked so hard to build. Exactly as I predicted, living under her own restrictions was becoming unbearable for her. The breaking point finally arrived on day 7. She spent the afternoon shopping with the women from what I privately started calling the Rulemakers Club, but she completely ignored the very system she had demanded I follow. No hourly updates, no spending approvals, No location check-ins. When she finally returned home carrying multiple shopping bags, I was already waiting. That's 7 separate rule violations in a single afternoon, I said calmly while scrolling through my phone. No location updates. No hourly check-ins. No approval for purchases. No verification of social activity. I was busy, she snapped immediately. You already knew who I was with. That excuse wouldn't have been acceptable for me under your system, I pointed out calmly. So it doesn't work for you either. She dropped the shopping bags near the door in frustration. What exactly do you want from me? She demanded. I want you to admit this system doesn't work, I answered quietly. Fine, she finally admitted. It's not working. That's a start, I replied calmly. But I need you to understand something deeper than that. These rules were never truly about improving our marriage. They were about control and about impressing your friends. That's not fair, she protested softly, though even she didn't sound convinced anymore. Let's be completely honest for once, I continued. Would you ever have created these rules if your friends weren't constantly comparing stories about controlling their husbands? If this hadn't become some kind of competition? Her silence answered the question more clearly than words ever could. You know what hurts the most? I asked quietly. Not the fact that you try to control me, but the fact that you believed I wouldn't notice. That you assumed I would quietly accept becoming some kind of project you could brag about in front of your friends. She slowly lowered herself into a chair, and for the first time since this entire situation began, the mask finally cracked. Not the practice tears she had used earlier. Real vulnerability. They make it look so easy, she admitted softly. Their husbands just go along with everything. Then either those husbands have already given up, I answered, or those wives aren't being honest about what those relationships actually look like behind closed doors. Either way, that's not the kind of marriage I want. For the first time in days, I saw genuine emotion in her eyes. What happens now? She asked quietly. I sat down across from her. Now we decide what kind of marriage we actually want, I said. Do we want a partnership, or do we want a constant battle for control? I'm tired of fighting, she admitted. So am I replied. But I will never accept being controlled. Not by you. Not by anyone. She nodded slowly, and in that moment I realized something fundamental had shifted between us. The power struggle was ending. Not because I had defeated her, but because I had refused to participate in the game on her terms. What about the rules? She asked after a long silence. I reached for the laminated sheet that had started this entire disaster. I think we both already know what needs to happen to these. 2 months later, I still remember feeding that rule sheet through the paper shredder. The sound of the machine tearing it apart felt symbolic, like the destruction of everything toxic that had come between us. That moment marked the beginning of something entirely new. Not a return to the marriage we once had. Something stronger. That same night, after destroying the rules, we stayed awake talking until sunrise. Truly talking for the first time in months, without manipulation, hidden motives, or power games. She admitted how much influence her new social circle had over her. Those women constantly competed over how much control they had inside their marriages, and she had slowly become addicted to the validation that came from participating in that environment. It made me feel powerful, she confessed, like I finally belonged somewhere. Then her expression softened, but it never actually felt right. Deep down, I knew this wasn't who we were. I just got swept into it, she admitted quietly. I share my side too. I explained how painful it had been watching her slowly change into someone unrecognizable. How betrayed I felt by the attempts to monitor and control every aspect of my life. Most of all, I admitted how much I missed the partnership we used to have before everything became about dominance and control. The very next day, she left the group chat completely. 2 days later, she skipped the weekly brunch. By the end of that week, she had made her position clear to the women she once considered friends. Her marriage was not a competition, and her husband was not a project to manage. The transition back to normal wasn't perfect or effortless. Habits built over months don't disappear overnight. There were still moments when she slipped back into controlling behaviors, moments where she tested whether my boundaries were still firm. Every time it happened, I calmly reminded her of our new understanding. Not with anger, not with resentment, just with complete clarity about what I would and would not accept in our relationship. What surprised me most was how quickly everything rebalanced once I stopped participating in her game. The truth was painful but simple. Her control had only existed because I allowed it to. The second I established one clear principle, that any rule applying to one person must apply equally to the other, the entire structure collapsed under its own hypocrisy. Now we've created healthier patterns together. When important decisions come up, we discuss them as equals. When boundaries are necessary, they apply to both of us fairly. Trust slowly returned, not because of rules or demands, but because of consistent actions and mutual respect. We still check in with each other sometimes, but now we do it because we genuinely want it, not because someone is enforcing it. Last week, one of her former friends sent her a message. Apparently, that woman's husband had finally reached his limit and walked out after years of being treated more like an employee than a partner. Now she wanted advice on how to regain control over him. My wife's response was simple. I don't have that answer anymore. What saved our marriage was learning to treat each other as equals. Later that evening, we sat together on the porch watching the sunset when she suddenly turned toward me thoughtfully. How did you know that one rule would change everything? She asked. Because control only survives when it's one-sided, I explained. The moment it became mutual, it exposed itself for what it truly was. She sat quietly for a moment before speaking again. You could have walked away, she said softly. Most men probably would have. But walking away was never my goal, I answered honestly. Restoring balance was. I wasn't trying to win a power struggle. I wanted to end the struggle completely. That's the real lesson behind everything that happened. In relationships, true power doesn't belong to the person who creates the most rules or controls every situation. Real strength comes from understanding your boundaries and having the courage to protect them. I didn't need 20 rules to fight her 20 rules. I didn't need threats, manipulation, or emotional games. I only needed one simple principle. What is acceptable for one person must be acceptable for both. In the end, that single boundary accomplished more than endless arguments ever could. It transformed our marriage from a toxic battle for control back into a genuine partnership. Not through domination, not through force, but simply by refusing to continue playing a game that had been unfair from the beginning. Some people might describe it as standing up for myself. I see it differently. I was standing up for us, for the relationship we both deserved, instead of the competition she had been pressured into believing marriage was supposed to be.